The sound of a beer can snapping open broke the quiet of the living room. Clark Miller stood in the doorway, grocery bags biting into his fingers, watching his son-in-law sink deeper into the recliner like a man who owned the place. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, washing the room in a golden haze that should have felt like home. Instead, it felt foreign. Harry didn't look up from the TV. "Since you're standing there, old man, grab me another." Clark placed the groceries gently on the counter, his hand stiff from the cold walk home. He glanced at the chair, Martha's chair, the last piece of furniture she'd chosen before the cancer took her. Every scuff, every curve of the armrest still whispered of her presence. Now Harry's boots dug into the cushions like it was his throne. Before Clark could speak, Tiffany entered, drying her hands on a dish towel. She wore that impatient look he remembered from her teenage years, a mix of wariness and quiet demand. "Dad, just get him the drink, please. It's not worth making a scene." Her words struck harder than Harry's laziness. Not worth making a scene, not worth defending himself, not worth being respected in his own house. Clark took a breath, the air trembling in his chest. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't lecture, he simply said, "No." The room froze. Harry's head finally turned, a smirk cutting across his face. "What did you say?" "No," Clark repeated, steady this time, the single word carrying the weight of every silent sacrifice he'd ever made. Tiffany's jaw tightened. She walked closer, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband as though drawing a line. "Dad," she said carefully, "if you're going to live here, you need to stop fighting him. Either you help Harry, or you can leave." Silence. The kind that hums in your ears and makes your pulse louder than the world around you. Clark looked at his daughter. His only child, the girl he once carried on his shoulders during parades, the one who cried into his chest during storms. Her eyes were different now. Cold. Hardened, borrowed from the man beside her, and in that silence, something inside him shifted. He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curl of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. Then he walked past both of them, without another word. His shoes tapped the hardwood, each step measured, final, toward the bedroom. Harry let out a laugh, low and mocking. "That's what I thought." But it wasn't. Inside the bedroom, Clark pulled the suitcase from the closet shelf. Dust fell from the zipper like time shaking loose. He placed it on the bed Martha once made with meticulous care, the quilt still carrying faint traces of her perfume. With methodical precision, he packed 2 shirts, a pair of trousers, socks rolled tight. Nothing more than what freedom required. From the nightstand, he lifted a framed photo of Martha, her smile wide, her arm looped through his during their honeymoon. He wrapped it in tissue and tucked it in the side pocket. By the time he returned to the hallway, suitcase in hand, Tiffany's face had shifted from sternness to shock. "Dad, wait." He didn't stop walking. The front door creaked open, sunlight spilling in across the hardwood floor. Clark stepped into the light, the house behind him fading into shadow. He paused only long enough to say, without looking back, "You wanted me gone. Now you'll see what that really means." The door closed with a quiet click, leaving Tiffany and Harry in the echo of their own ultimatum. Clark walked down the driveway, suitcase rolling over cracked concrete, each step lighter than the last. He wasn't running. He wasn't defeated. He was free. The Bix engine coughed once before settling into its familiar low rumble. Clark adjusted the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of the house he had poured his life into. Curtains drawn, porch light still broken, paint peeling at the edges. It looked small now, almost unworthy of the decades of sacrifice it represented. He didn't slow down. The road stretched ahead, pine trees arching like guardians over the pavement. It was late afternoon, that golden hour when the sky softens and shadows lengthen. His suitcase rattled in the trunk with every bump, but Clark's mind was elsewhere. On birthdays paid for with overtime shifts, tuition bills signed without hesitation, and wedding costs swallowed in silence, every memory carried a receipt. At the motel on the edge of town, the neon sign flickered the word vacancy in tired red letters. Clark pulled into the lot, parked between 2 pickups, and cut the engine. For the first time in years, the silence felt clean. No TV blasting sports he didn't care about, no arguments simmering beneath polite words, no footsteps of someone who believed he owed them his existence. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and cigarette smoke buried beneath cheap carpet. A single bed with stiff sheets, a desk, a chair, nothing more. To anyone else, it would look like exile. To Clark, it looked like possibility. He set the suitcase on the luggage rack and opened it. The photo of Martha lay on top of the folded clothes. He lifted it gently, brushing a thumb over her smile. "You'd have told me to leave years ago," he murmured. He set the frame on the nightstand, angled so she faced the door. A silent witness. Clark sat at the desk and pulled out the small leather journal he'd carried for years. Inside, neat columns tracked every dollar spent. College tuition, mortgage assistance, insurance premiums, groceries, car repairs. At the bottom of each page, he'd scrawled a simple note for Tiffany. Now he flipped to a blank page. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote a new header for me. The pen hovered before he added the first entry: room 12, Pine Lodge Motel, No. 52. Paid in cash. It wasn't much, but it was his. The phone on the nightstand buzzed suddenly, startling him. He reached over. 7 missed calls, all Tiffany. The 8th came in as he stared at the screen, her contact photo flashing. A smiling girl in a graduation cap, long before Harry. He let it ring. When the voicemail tone beeped, Tiffany's voice spilled out, trembling but sharp. "Dad, what are you doing? The mortgage payment bounced. Harry says you're messing with accounts again. You can't just walk out and leave us like this. Call me back, please." The clerk closed his eyes, the words cutting deep. "Leave us." As if he hadn't been the one holding them up all these years. As if absence was a crime greater than exploitation. Another buzz. Another message. This time Harry's voice. "You think you can just run away? You owe us, Clark. Don't forget whose family you're in. Call me, or you'll regret it." The clerk deleted the messages without listening to the ends. The motel walls held their silence like a blessing. Outside, headlights swept across the curtains as cars passed by, heading toward downtown. Laughter carried faintly from the diner 2 blocks over. Normal lives continuing without him, without Tiffany, without Harry. He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. His body ached. But it was the H of release, like muscles loosening after years clenched tight. For the first time in decades, Clark wasn't the banker, the provider, the dependable safety net. He wasn't the man people called when something broke, when bills stacked too high, when dreams outpaced paychecks. For the first time in decades, Clark Miller belonged only to himself. He smiled in the dim motel light, whispering to the photo of Martha. "Let's see what happens when they stand without me." The phone buzzed again, unanswered. Clark drifted into sleep with a steady breath, the hum of the fan above him, and the weight of silence cradling his resolve. Sunday morning arrived with rain tapping against the motel window, steady and relentless. Clark woke early, the kind of rest that felt earned rather than borrowed. He brewed motel coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard, sat at the desk, and opened his leather journal. One by one, he flipped through pages filled with Tiffany's name. College tuition, wedding expenses, mortgage payments. Each line was a ledger of devotion disguised as obligation. Clark picked up his pen and circled the most recent entry: mortgage, $1,200, due first of the month. He stared at the number, then drew a line through it. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote beneath cancelled. His hand trembled, not with doubt, but with something sharper: liberation. By noon, he was at the diner down the street, a plate of eggs cooling in front of him. The waitress refilled his cup without asking, and he nodded politely, though his mind was elsewhere. On his phone, banking apps blinked open, balances glowing against the screen. One swipe, and the automatic mortgage payment was gone. Another, and car insurance for vehicles he didn't drive was cancelled. He paused before the credit cards. Tiffany's name sat beneath his own, an authorized user. With a final tap, she disappeared from the account. Just like that, the invisible ropes tying him to their chaos loosened. The phone rang almost immediately. "Tiffany," he didn't answer. 5 minutes later, Harry. Clark left the phone face down on the table and finished his coffee. By the time he returned to the motel, the phone was lit with missed calls. He listened to the voicemails in order, each one a progression from confidence to panic. "Dad, there's a problem with the mortgage. Can you fix it? Clark, you'd better call me back. This isn't funny. Dad, please. The bank says they'll start foreclosure if the payment doesn't clear by Friday. You old fool, you think you can embarrass me like this? Fix it." No. Clark sat in silence, listening to the desperation build, like watching a dam crack under pressure. He deleted each message after hearing it, his thumb steady. When the last one ended, the motel room felt impossibly quiet. That evening, he drove through town, headlights catching familiar landmarks. The church steeple, the hardware store, the library where Tiffany had studied late into the night. Every place carried a memory of support, of sacrifice. As he passed the hardware store, Tom Kowalski, the owner, waved from the doorway. Clark pulled over, lowering the window. "Clark," Tom said, leaning against the frame, "I heard you're out at Pine Lodge. Everything all right?" Clark hesitated, then answered simply, "I chose dignity." Tom studied him, eyes narrowing with understanding. "Harry giving you trouble again?" Clark didn't reply. He didn't need to. Small towns didn't require explanations, they only needed hints. By the next morning, the whispers had begun. At the grocery store, at the post office, at the diner counter, people trading stories about how long Clark had supported Tiffany and Harry, how much he'd given. By noon, sympathy had shifted, and judgment began to turn its gaze on Harry. That afternoon, Tiffany finally showed up at the motel. She knocked softly, rain dripping from her coat. Clark opened the door but didn't step aside. Her eyes were swollen, voice frayed. "Dad, you can't just cut us off like this. We'll lose everything." Clark's face was calm, almost serene. "Maybe it's time you learn what everything costs." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but he didn't waver. For years, he'd bent under the weight of love, mistaking sacrifice for survival. Now, standing in the doorway with the storm at her back, Clark realized the truth. This wasn't punishment, this was freedom, and it was only just beginning. By midweek, the motel phone had become an alarm clock of desperation. Every morning it rang before sunrise, unknown numbers, collectors hunting Harry, or Tiffany's tearful pleas. Clark answered none of them, but the pressure wasn't confined to voicemail. It leaked into town. At the diner, people leaned closer when he walked in. Conversations hushed, then swelled again once he passed. Sympathy, yes, but also curiosity. Clark had always been the steady one, the man who paid his bills on time, who showed up with a firm handshake and a gentle smile. Now whispers painted him as a father pushed too far. That evening, while stirring sugar into his coffee, a familiar voice broke through the murmur of the diner. "Clark Miller, as I live and breathe." Bob Harrison, an old colleague from the bank, slid into the booth opposite him. Bob's hair was whiter now, his frame heavier, but his eyes still carried that sharp banker's gaze. "You're staying out at Pine Lodge, huh?" "Heard some things." Clark offered a wry smile. "Everyone's heard some things." Bob leaned closer, lowering his voice. "What I heard is worse. Your son-in-law tried to file a loan application under your house. Claimed it was his. Documents looked good, until we dug deeper. Forged signatures, false paperwork. If I hadn't recognized your name, we might have approved $50,000 in his favor." The Clark's coffee went cold between his hands. His silence said more than any outburst could. Bob's voice softened. "Clark, you need to be careful. Men who forge papers against family don't stop at a denied loan. They double down." The warning echoed long after Bob left. That night, Clark paced the motel room, the hum of the ceiling fan mixing with the storm inside his head. Tiffany's voice on the last voicemail replayed in memory. "Dad, please. Harry says you're ruining us." But now he saw the truth. Harry hadn't just disrespected him. He'd been plotting to steal everything. The ultimatum had never been about dominance, it had been about access. Clark wasn't a father-in-law to Harry, he was a bank. And the bank had just closed. Clark sat heavily on the bed, Martha's photo in his hand. He whispered into the silence, "I should have left sooner, shouldn't I?" Her smile, frozen in the frame, offered no answer, but he felt one anyway. Yes. 2 days later, Tiffany appeared again. This time she wasn't crying, she was shaking with anger. "You've destroyed us, Dad. Do you understand that?" She stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her hair, fists balled at her sides. "The mortgage, the cars, the bills. We can't keep up. Harry says you're punishing us." Clark kept his voice calm. "I stopped paying for 2 adults who should be standing on their own feet. That's not punishment, Tiffany. That's reality. You've changed." She spat. "Mom would never have let you do this." The words hit like glass shattering. For a moment, the old ache returned, sharp and merciless. Martha's absence was still an open wound. But Clark steadied himself. "Your mother taught me to love you. Not to enable you." Tiffany's breath hitched. For the first time, her fury flickered into doubt. But then Harry's voice carried from the parking lot. "Is he giving us the speech again? Waste of time. Come on, Tiff." She froze, torn between father and husband, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Then she turned sharply and stormed away, her footsteps splashing through puddles. Clark closed the door quietly, but his hands shook. That night, his phone buzzed again. This time not with Tiffany's number, but an unknown one. The message was brief. "Old man, you don't know who you're messing with. You'll regret this." Clark stared at the glowing words until the screen dimmed. The motel room felt smaller, darker. Freedom was no longer just about dignity, it was about survival. The storm was building. Saturday morning, downtown buzzed like a hive. Farmers set up stalls in the square, kids tugged at balloon strings, and neighbors traded gossip over steaming cups of coffee. Clark walked with slow purpose, the brim of his hat shielding him from the rising sun. He felt eyes on him. Some curious, some sympathetic. But he kept moving until he reached the steps of the bank. The same building where he'd signed away overtime hours, where he'd signed loans for neighbors, where he'd once believed sacrifice always led to gratitude. Today, the air felt different, thicker, charged, because Harry was already there. He stood at the corner, loud enough for half the street to hear, his arms slicing the air as he spoke. "The old man's lost it, kicked his own daughter out, refuses to help while she's carrying his grandchild." A small crowd gathered, brows furrowed, whispers spreading like kindling catching flame. Tiffany hovered at his side, arms wrapped tight around herself, her face pale. Clark stopped at the edge of the circle, his presence enough to silence the chatter. Harry spun, face flushed with false outrage. Well, here he is, the selfish coward who abandoned his family." The crowd's eyes shifted, hungry for answers. Clark didn't raise his voice. $18,000 in gambling debt. He said it evenly, like reading a balance sheet. "Poker tables at Glacier Peaks Casino. Detective Morrison has the file." The words struck like a hammer. Murmurs rippled. A few heads turned toward Tiffany, whose lips parted in shock. Harry's bravado faltered. "That's a damn lie." "Forgery isn't," Clark interrupted, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Loan application. $50,000. My signature copied, my house listed as collateral. Bob Harrison at the bank has the documents. He's willing to testify." The crowd stiffened. A neighbor muttered, "Forgery's a felony." Another whispered, "I knew something was off about him." Harry lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger. "You think you can smear me, you bitter old fool?" Clark didn't flinch, his gaze was steady, his voice controlled. "I think the truth smears itself." For a moment, the town square held its breath. Tiffany's eyes darted between her husband and her father, panic rising. "Harry, is it true?" Harry's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His silence screamed louder than any denial. The crowd shifted, loyalty tilting like scales. Some stepped back from Harry. Others looked at Clark with something closer to respect than pity. Clark turned to Tiffany, his voice soft but unyielding. "You told me to serve him, or leave. I chose to leave. Now you see why." Her face crumpled, the weight of realization pressing down until her knees nearly buckled. Harry grabbed her arm, hissing through clenched teeth, "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to turn you against me." But Tiffany pulled free. For the first time, her eyes didn't carry Harry's reflection. They carried her own. "You lied to me," she whispered, voice trembling. "All this time." The crowd shifted again, murmurs louder now, judgment heavier. Harry's mask cracked completely. Rage flared, raw and ugly. He lunged toward Clark, hand raised. Gasps rippled. But before he could close the distance, two uniformed officers stepped forward from the crowd, Detective Morrison among them. "That's far enough, Harry." His voice cut clean, official, undeniable. Harry froze, cornered by law, community, and truth. Clark stood motionless, calm in the chaos, his dignity a shield. For the first time in years, the weight wasn't on him. It was on Harry, where it belonged. And as Tiffany sank to her knees, tears streaming, Clark finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding for decades. The ultimatum was finished. The motel room felt different after that day in the square. Lighter, as though the walls had exhaled. Clark sat at the desk, Martha's photo propped against the lamp, a cup of real coffee steaming beside him. He had thought the climax would bring chaos, but instead it brought clarity. Harry was gone within 48 hours, hauled into questioning for the forgery, shunned by the community, and finally vanishing from town in a rust-red pickup weighed down by more debt than dignity. Tiffany stayed behind, the echo of her public humiliation still raw. She came to see Clark once a week later, no anger this time, no ultimatums, just exhaustion. "Dad," she whispered at the doorway, voice thin as paper. "I don't know who I am without him." The Clark looked at her. His daughter, older now, stripped of illusions, and answered softly, "Then it's time to find out." She nodded, tears slipping down, but there was a flicker of something new in her eyes. Resolve. Months passed. Snow gave way to thaw, then bloom. Clark traded the motel for a small cabin near the lake, a place where the mornings smelled of pine, and the evenings glowed with sunsets that set the water on fire. He fished, he read, he learned the shape of silence until it no longer felt empty but whole. The house, his old house, didn't sit idle. He donated it to a veteran housing initiative, and 3 families moved in. One evening, he stood at the curb while children's laughter spilled from the yard. A little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing toward him. "Who's that man?" Her mother smiled. "The one who gave us this chance." Clark turned away before they could thank him. Some gifts didn't need acknowledgement. They only needed to live. Tiffany called from time to time. At first, her words were clumsy apologies, rehearsed but fragile. Later, they grew steadier updates from therapy, news about her job, questions about recipes her mother used to make. She never asked for money. She asked for time. One spring morning, she texted simply coffee. "My treat this time." At the diner, she arrived early, nervously stirring sugar into a cup. When Clark walked in, she stood, uncertain, then wrapped her arms around him with the awkwardness of someone relearning how to hold. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said once they sat. "I'm asking for a chance to earn it." Clark studied her, then nodded slowly. "Forgiveness is already given. Trust, that takes work. One honest action at a time." Her eyes shone with unshed tears, but she smiled through them. For the first time, it wasn't manipulation, it was hope. That night, Clark sat on the cabin's porch, the lake calm under a silver moon. He sipped his coffee and thought of Martha. He imagined her there beside him, feet tucked under a blanket, nodding in approval at the hard, won piece. He whispered to the quiet water, "We did it, love. We didn't bend. We didn't break." Somewhere in the distance, laughter rang from the veteran families in his old house. It carried across the water like an answer. Clark leaned back, letting the sound settle in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt the simple truth of freedom. Not given, not stolen, but chosen. And he knew, as the moon climbed higher and the world hushed around him, that dignity, once claimed, was never something anyone could take away again. Final line. The night held its breath, the lake shimmering like glass, and Clark Miller sat steady in the silence. No longer a father abandoned, but a man restored.